Welcome to the Orca. The Alberta election is in full swing as NDP Premier Rachel Notley and United Conservative leader Jason Kenney duke it out in really what has become a no-holds-barred campaign battle. Now, you'll remember back in 2015, Notley rode the centre-right vote split to the NDP's first ever victory in Alberta, but polls show that she faces an uphill battle now for re-election. Mark Milke is a political scientist. He's a policy analyst who has worked for both the Fraser Institute and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He's also the author of a new book called Ralph versus Rachel, a tale of two Alberta premiers, which compares the records of Rachel Notley and the legendary Alberta Premier Ralph Klein. And Mark joins us now via Skype to talk more about the Notley record. Mark, good morning and welcome to the Orca.
Thank you for having me on, Rick.
What do you say to those who believe that Rachel Notley inherited a sagging economy in Alberta and her leadership was actually doomed from the beginning?
Well, she did inherit a sagging economy, right? I mean, oil prices collapsed by 2/3 over the course of a year, and she came right in the middle of that. But to put it in some perspective, it's not like Ralph Klein had a May Day picnic, so to speak, back when he came into power in late 1992-93, so just over 25 years ago. Oil and gas prices were low. He balanced the books 2 years later when oil and gas prices and then provincial revenues were still low. And in fact, if you go back to the mid-1990s, he had his own challenges. I mean, we're old enough to remember interest rates from the 80s and 90s. The years preceding Ralph Klein's ascension to power, and just after, interest rates range from, it was like 3 or 4% to 10%, depending on the year. And of course, when Rachel Notley came into power, interest rates ranged from literally like 0.75% to 1.25% from the Bank of Canada. So they both had different challenges. I mean, Ralph Klein walked into a situation where interest rates were eating up all sorts of program spending in the budget. He had to cut spending dramatically to get it back into balance. Rachel Notley faced low oil prices, but they took very different paths after taking power. I mean, were, and are diametrically opposed to each other's policies.
Notley has in many ways come up against members of her own party who advocate on behalf of in her advocating on behalf of the energy sector. She's been a very strong advocate for the energy sector, while members of her party have not been. At the same time, though, she's run into the anti-energy advocates who seem to have taken a foothold in both Ottawa and Victoria, which is something Ralph Klein didn't have to deal with. How is she dealt with that? And
Right.
How would you assess her performance with that?
Right. I mean, the similarities are almost eerie. I mean, if you go back, I mean, there are differences, but the similarities first. If you go back to the 1980s, there was a Trudeau in office in Ottawa that was not great for Alberta or frankly the West. I grew up in Kelowna, as you may know, but
Yes.
and I remember those days well, the early 80s. They were not pleasant for British Columbia or Alberta or much of the West. So you had a Trudeau in office back then. You have a Trudeau in office now with damaging policy. That's the similarity. It's true there's a lot more, I would say, activism and of the sort that's not helpful from environmentalists. There's helpful activism, but there's unhelpful activism. And I put some of what's been happening in the last 10 years in the latter category. So she faced that. But frankly, Rachel Notley also was criticizing the oil sands when she was a third-party leader in the legislature and just an MLA before that, before she took over as leader. Her colleagues, for example, Shannon Phillips and others, and Brian Mason, who's transportation minister in the current government, were all over the oil sands, criticizing them when they were back just again in a third-party place in the legislature. So they've had a long history of activism themselves. I mean, the current environment minister, Shannon Phillips in Alberta, wrote a foreword to a book by a Greenpeace radical and talked about breaking laws. So that was in the book. I mean, this is the culture that they came from. I mean, the NDP have gone a long way from what they used to be, which was a mixture of socialism and blue-collar concerns. And now they represent what? Mainly the public sector. I think they've kicked blue-collar labor across the country to the curb. So they represent public sector labor. And of course, there's a growing environmental influence, which again, on some days is good and some days can be terrible if it becomes dogmatic and purist, which I think some organizations like Greenpeace or the Pembina Institute exactly are. And so, yes, Rachel Notley faces that. But look, she also opposed pipelines like Northern Gateway. She sat on her hands on Keystone XL, right? So the Premier of Alberta has a long record here. And what she and her colleagues advocated before they came into power has kind of come a cropper. So, I mean, unfortunately, Alberta's in a perfect storm. I have very little sympathy for a premier when she knocks energy development pre-2015 and now purports to be its champion. Now, that's just politics, and all politics is local.
Exactly right. And as you know now, she has a Trudeau in Ottawa that's purchased a pipeline. She's advocating buying even rail cars to get her product to Tidewater.
She's doing more than advocating. She just signed a deal for $3.7 billion.
Exactly.
That makes your fast ferry experiment in British Columbia look cheap by comparison, going back 20 years to Glenn Clark.
But now we've come to the point where we're hearing phrases not only in the provincial election but in the coming federal election, phrases like Western alienation, separation. They're starting to bubble to the surface in this provincial election. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, one of the things I've looked at in Ralph versus Rachel, but also other books and other studies, is equalization. And there's a great amount of frustration with that program and with federal transfers in Alberta. And again, I mean, look at it this way. First of all, I'm no separatist. I should put that up front. I don't think it's a good idea for a whole bunch of reasons. But when you get 50% of the public sympathetic to it, according to one poll I mused over recently, you've got a problem. And again, it results from this crazy notion that, I don't know, the resource sector in this country, whether it's northern British Columbia, whether it's somewhere in Quebec, or whether it's Alberta and Saskatchewan, oil and gas, whether it's minerals, forestry, or energy, that somehow we can just transition from this. I mean, I think Jock Finlayson from the Business Council of BC looked at the high-tech sector in BC and said, basically this is, a very small percentage of the economy, and it's still lower than, I think it was, like, I don't know, a tenth or 1/100th. I have to check my stats. But it's a pretty small chunk compared to, say, mining or forestry, even in BC. So this notion that you can move away from what people use every day, whether it's oil and gas or the stuff you get out of the ground in British Columbia that provides minerals, I think is just fanciful. And I think what Albertans are feeling, and why you see such an uptick in anger at Ottawa and even separatist sentiment, is that, look, what's a province in the middle of the North American continent with no coastal access supposed to do? And this is supposed to be a free trading country. That was George Brown, Johnny MacDonald. That was 1867. A big part of Confederation was knock down the barriers. And there's some historical stuff here, by the way, I think your listeners or viewers should know. I mean, look, and I'm from British Columbia originally. You go back 80 years, and there was an understanding in British Columbia vis-a-vis the prairies that they needed, the prairies needed BC lumber, and this is what a free trading country does. So it's crazy that one part of the province or one part of the country now really blocks their products from another part of the province. And in fact, BC was very dependent, for example, on agriculture from the prairies if you go back 80 or 90 years. And this comes from a Royal Commission report I read a couple of years ago. But anyway, to put it in big context, the reason you've got frustration in Alberta is because we produce a lot of wealth still, even though it's less than it used to be. We pay a lot of money into the federal government. We get very little of it back. That's fine in prosperous years for the most part. But when you have a Quebec premier saying, I don't want your dirty oil, but he's willing to accept dirty oil money, you're going to get people in Alberta going, this is nuts.
Do you think we're perhaps looking at the redefinition of Confederation then? Or at least the redistribution of money through Confederation?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought the federal transfer program system is not nonsensical, especially equalization. It basically gives Quebec or any province the incentive not to develop its economy, right? Whether it's New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, which ban fracking, for example, for natural gas onshore, or Quebec, which pretty much doesn't develop its resource sector in the way it could, including oil and gas. It gives provinces an incentive to say, we're poor at the equalization table, give us more, to Ottawa. And they get it. And so I think we've got actually policies in place at the federal level that just don't make any sense. And even though equalization is in the Constitution, it's not strong, according to constitutional experts that I've read. So it can be reformed, and it ought to be reformed. It's just, it's beyond belief, again, that some of the richest parts in the country, including British Columbia and Ontario, by the way, which pay more to Confederation than they get out, should be supporting provinces which make backward economic decisions. I mean, it's fine if you don't want to develop your entire province, but then it means you will have lower levels of services, or that's what it should mean. And meanwhile, you get to block pipelines from Alberta. So again, it's the federal transfer payment system, especially equalization, is not well designed. It needs to change. And I think you're going to see, if a Jason Kenney government gets into power, you're going to see a new government align with Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and push the federal government for changes on this. And there's some reason to believe they might be half successful.
I want to get back to your book for a moment, Ralph versus Rachel. You talked a little bit about the eerie similarities that these two premiers had when they came into office. When you look at their body of work, what else jumps out to you?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because most Albertans still have fond memories of Ralph Klein. No one's perfect. Rachel Notley's not, Ralph Klein is not. But in terms of policies and in terms of his approach, he was forthright. He said, here's what we're going to do. He did it. People liked him for it. Alberta is very much a free enterprise province, like half of British Columbia is. But it's still a strong ethos here. And Ralph Klein tapped into that. Rachel Notley is in opposition to it. What struck me, one of the things that struck me is you do get a myth from, I would say, the interventionist crowd here in Alberta that somehow the Ralph Klein years were terrible, dystopian. Look, the numbers and the rhetoric back in the 1990s, from the newspapers even, simply don't reflect that reality. We were already talking about a boom time back in 1997.
That's what I remember. When Ralph was in the chair, it seemed Alberta was riding the wave.
Right, and you said the greatest economic development policy for Alberta is a NDP government in British Columbia, too. Things were going great here. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I encountered when I did research for Ralph versus Rachel is the stats, the job statistics for, say, those who don't have much education, right? Because no matter where you live, if you don't have a high school education, you don't finish high school, your chances of being employed are pretty slim, except in Alberta. And despite massive in-migration because of the jobs that were being created here, you had a 1 in 10 chance of being employed in Alberta, a 9 in 10 chance of being employed in Alberta if you only finished high school, compared to, say, 20% unemployment in Ontario and Quebec, or 32% unemployment in Newfoundland at the time. If you never finished high school, you similarly had a much better chance of being employed in Alberta than anywhere else in the country. And I have a friend who never finished high school, got into a particularly bad situation, was in the middle of a divorce, needed a job, started her own cleaning company for $35 an hour. And think about that. You don't have a high school education, a certificate, and you're making $35 an hour at the height of the boom cleaning houses in Alberta. It allowed her to make a great living. That's what Ralph Klein's policies led to. Obviously it helps to have oil and gas, but what the Klein government did was say, we're open for business. We're going to make it easy to invest here. And a lot of politicians don't necessarily get that, right? We're not selling Hawaii's weather, except for my hometown of Kelowna. Neither is British Columbia. You've got Vancouver's pleasant, but it rains a lot, as we know. So you got to say yes to the resources or to the economic comparative advantage that you have. For Alberta, that's energy. For Quebec and Ontario, it's manufacturing and export potential in the United States. For British Columbia, it's the Pacific Rim. The politicians have to say yes to this stuff, and frankly, they also have to say no to what you mentioned earlier, the not in my backyard activists who want to shut down everything except a subsidy to, I don't know, Tesla.
Listen, before we go, I have to ask you, Rachel Notley enjoys a pretty good personal rating in the polls, better than her party. Jason Kenney, just the opposite. His party seems more popular than him. Who wins?
Well, I mean, those polls are probably outdated now. I mean, I've seen some recent polling that shows Jason Kenney's more popular than, at least as popular as his party, and that Rachel Notley is less popular than Jason Kenney. So the fact that she's slightly marginally more popular than her party says a lot more about the unpopularity of the NDP than it does about the popularity of Rachel Notley. So look, she's still an ideologue. I mean, this is someone who wore a Che Guevara wristwatch, for heaven's sakes, for years, right? Che Guevara. I mean, a guy who was a murderer and a thug, and accompanied Fidel Castro around for a couple of years. So Rachel Notley is as ideological as they come, as ideological as many of the fun NDPers I used to have fun with in British Columbia, writing about and taking issue with when I was there. So I don't think Rachel Notley will survive in a free enterprise Alberta, but I never thought Donald Trump would win either. So what do I know?
Always a pleasure. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you.